Vladimir Putin has said he is ready for respectful dialogues. That's the way it was put. Just a day after President Donald Trump threatened Russia with tariffs and sanctions if he fails to make a deal to end the conflict.
Yeah, meanwhile, close to home, a Navy submarine is monitoring the movements of a Russian spy boat that entered British waters earlier this week.
Well, joining us now is Defence Secretary John Healey. Good to speak to you this morning. We saw you in Parliament, didn't we, on Wednesday, talking about this incident, and it seemed unusual to me to be discussing the incident so openly, and also alarming to think of that threat. What do you think the degree of threat is?
Well, I disclosed this to Parliament and I authorised a Royal Navy submarine to surface very close to a Russian spy ship recently that was in British waters, because I wanted to send a very clear signal to Putin that we see him, we know what he's doing, and we're monitoring him and his ships every step of the way when they're in our British waters. And we're also working with other allies, the Nordic countries and the Baltics, who have also seen damage and potential sabotage to many of their cables that connect their countries, and our daily lives depend on these energy, communications, internet cables, which is why we need to work hard to keep them secure.
Yeah, so you see them. This time it was a warning. If, as you say, in other areas around the world we've seen cables cut, would you consider that an act of war? And what would Britain do? Would we use a lethal weapon against a vessel of in that activity?
Part of the way of making deterrence effective is not being clear what you will do in certain circumstances. But on Christmas Day, when that cable was damaged that broke the connection between Finland and Estonia, they were part of an operation now that we're working together to monitor the movement of suspected Russian shadow fleet breaking sanctions or their spy ships. And that tanker was boarded by Finnish commandos. It was seized by Finland. So there is action that nations like us can take if there are damage or suspected sabotage to the cables on which we depend. And part of the reason for disclosing this to the public is to alert them to the risk. But part of disclosing this during the week was to say to Putin, we are watching you. We're watching you with allies, and the aggression that you are directing to our countries alongside your full-scale war in Ukraine will be responded to by the strongest possible response.
Donald Trump says that he'd end the war in Ukraine on day one, didn't he? We're now on day 5. He says that President Zelensky wants to make a deal. We heard a response to sanctions from Russia, saying that they're open to dialogue. What do you think this next stage looks like? What is the deal going to be?
Well, Putin could end this war in a day if he withdrew his troops from Ukraine, a sovereign country that he's invaded, and 3 years of a brutal war that he thought he would win within a week. And I welcome the fact that President Trump, in the first week of his presidency, is saying to Putin, you have to sue for peace. And President Trump is, he says, willing to exercise the sanctions and the economic pressures to help bring Putin to the table. And with that sort of leadership, those are the sort of moves that America is ready to make. Then countries like Britain will certainly add our weight to the pressure to try and end this war.
Can I now draw your attention to this horrific story, of course, of the death of the 3 young girls in Southport, Bibi, Elsie and Alice, and the sentencing of Axel Ruda-Cabana. A lot of people, some of the press and even some MPs calling for changes in the law because the sentencing perhaps has not been seen as being severe enough. Of course, because he was under 18 at the time of the murder, he couldn't be given a whole life term. What is the government's position on this, and what do you think needs to be done next?
Well, first, this is the day after the court sentencing. I feel it's a day of shock for the whole country, and I have to say that I feel it hard to catch my breath when I'm reading the reports of the savagery and the horror of the attacks that Ruda Pakana perpetrated. He didn't just kill Bibi and Elsie and Alice. He would have slaughtered the other girls in that 26-strong dance class if he could. And so on the question of his sentencing, the judge has sentenced him to 52 years in prison. We respect that ruling. And that judge has also made it clear that he doesn't expect Ruda Pakana to come out of jail in future. And that's a judgment that I support. On the question of whole life sentences, I think it's important to note that the previous government reduced the level of whole life sentences after the Manchester Arena bombing, when the bomber there was too young to be given a whole life sentence. They brought it down to 18. They didn't go further because of international law, and that's where it stands. But there may be other very important changes that we need to make to our laws, to our agencies, to our programmes, in light of the case that we read about and heard about in the sentencing yesterday. And the Prime Minister has made it clear that to honour the victims, to make the changes, nothing is off the table.
Yeah. What do you... I mean, we know that some of the information that's come out of here, so the fact that he was able to get access to a knife via Amazon, that he was still watching videos on the platform X of other stabbings before he made this horrific attack. And these are people that we know are in charge of these platforms, people like Jeff Bezos, who's in charge of Amazon, and Elon Musk, of course, who's in charge of X, and now he's both of them playing very big central parts in the American presidency, with working alongside Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself has just pardoned a chap called Ross Ulbricht, who ran a website that actually dealt in illegal weapons and actually had tutorials. I mean, where do we sit as a country now? We, at one hand, have got to defend our own and protect our own civilians, but we seem to be backing a government in America who are pardoning the kind of people that we absolutely believe that should be behind bars, and are actually supporting the kind of people that should be doing more on their platforms. Are we protecting our civilians, or are we protecting our special relationship with Donald Trump and America?
I think some of the lessons that can be drawn from this case, from an individual that was determined and dedicated to violence, was known to a range of agencies but not stopped or taken into any programme, means that we have some tough challenges to face. It's one of the reasons that the independent inquiry, launched now after the court case has concluded, will look at these things and started its work immediately. And there will also be the publication shortly of what the Home Secretary commissioned recently as a review of our Prevent Anti-Extremism programme, where there are clearly flaws in that and changes that will need to be made as well.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. John Healey, Secretary of State for Defence, thank you very much for joining us this morning